You ever wonder what it feels like to be the punchline in your own marriage? Ryan said it loud enough for 3 tables to hear, lifting his glass like he just delivered the line of the night, and the laughter came fast, sharp, easy, the kind that doesn't ask questions because it doesn't need to, and right there in the middle of it, standing under a chandelier that probably cost more than my first house, I smiled and took a sip of my bourbon like I agreed with them, like I belonged in the joke instead of being it. And the worst part wasn't Ryan, or the others, or even the room full of people who didn't know me. It was Olivia, my wife, standing half a step ahead of me in that emerald dress, laughing just a little louder than she needed to, like she was proving something to them, or maybe to herself. And if you had walked into that ballroom in downtown Chicago that night, you would have seen exactly what they saw, a man in an off-the-rack suit, quiet, forgettable. The kind of guy who nods more than he talks, the kind of guy who looks like he got lucky marrying a woman like Olivia Carter, senior director at one of the fastest-growing firms in the Midwest, the kind of woman people orbit around, the kind of woman who doesn't look back to see who's standing behind her. And for a second, just 1 second, I let the laughter settle in my chest, let it press down, not because it hurt, but because I needed it to. I needed to feel exactly how far they were willing to go. How comfortable they'd gotten, how careless people become when they think they're safe. And that's the thing about rooms like this, about people like them, they don't just laugh, they reveal. Every joke, every jab, every little comment wrapped in humor, it all adds up, it all tells you exactly who they are when they think no one's keeping score. And I was, every word, every look, every time Olivia didn't step in, didn't say my name, didn't even glance back to check if I was okay, I noticed it all, not with anger. Not even with disappointment, just quiet attention, the kind you learn when you've spent years listening more than you speak, the kind that lets you hear what's underneath the noise. Ryan leaned closer, lowering his voice just enough to make it feel personal while still keeping the audience. So what do you actually do, man? He asked, like he was genuinely curious, like the answer mattered, and I shrugged, slow, easy. I keep things running, I said, and that got another round of laughs because to them that meant nothing, meant I was nothing. Just the guy who shows up, who fills space, who exists in the margins of someone else's story. And Olivia didn't correct him, didn't clarify, didn't say a word. She just adjusted the bracelet on her wrist and smiled that polished smile she saved for rooms like this, the one that said everything was exactly the way it should be. And maybe that was the moment most people would have pushed back, said something sharp, tried to reclaim a little dignity in front of a crowd that had already decided who they were. But I didn't. I let it breathe, let it stretch, let them get comfortable. Because comfort is dangerous, it makes people honest in ways they don't even realize, it makes them say the quiet parts out loud, and I needed that, more than I needed respect, more than I needed Olivia to stand beside me. I needed them to keep going, to dig just a little deeper, to show me exactly how far the rot had spread, so I leaned back, nodded like I understood the joke, like I accepted my place in it, and raised my glass just slightly. Yeah, I said, calm, steady, almost amused. I guess you could say that. And the laughter came again, louder this time, fuller, like they'd been given permission, like I just confirmed everything they believed about me, and that was perfect, because the more they believed it, the easier everything else was going to be, the easier it would be to let them talk, to let them show their hands, to let the night unfold exactly the way I needed it to. And standing there in that room, with the music low and the lights warm and my wife laughing, like I wasn't even there, I made a simple decision. I wasn't going to stop them, not yet, because the truth is, I didn't need their respect, I needed their comfort, and they were giving it to me for free. I set the glass down slower this time, letting the weight of it rest against the polished table as the conversation around me kept moving like I had already faded into the background, which was exactly where they thought I belonged, and maybe exactly where I needed to be, because people talk differently when they think you are not part of the equation. They loosen up, they stop filtering. They forget that words can travel further than the room they are spoken in, and I could hear it now, the shift, subtle at first, Ryan leaning into Richard Hayes with that confident grin, talking numbers, talking projections, talking about departments like they were pieces on a board, and Olivia nodded along like she was already playing at that level, like she had earned her seat there without question, and I watched her for a second, not with anger, not even with disappointment, just observation, because when you strip away emotion, what you are left with is clarity, and clarity is useful. Especially when you are trying to understand where everyone really stands. I picked up a napkin, folded it once, then again, slow, deliberate, something to keep my hands busy while my attention stayed sharp, and Ryan's voice cut through again. The thing is, people like Ethan, they do not scale, he said, laughing lightly like it was harmless analysis, like I was a case study instead of a person. You need people who can actually drive growth, not just maintain. And a couple of heads nodded, including Olivia's, just a slight movement, almost invisible, but I saw it, I always saw it, because when you spend years building something from the ground up, you learn to notice the smallest shifts, the smallest tells, the difference between loyalty and convenience. And that was what this was, convenience. It was easier for her to agree, easier to fit in, easier to let them define me than to risk standing out herself. And that told me more than anything she could have said out loud. I leaned back in my chair, letting out a quiet breath, not heavy, not dramatic, just enough to remind myself to stay steady, because this was not the moment, not yet. Moments like this are not about reaction. They are about accumulation. Every sentence, every assumption, every careless comment, it all adds weight, and when the time comes, that weight matters. Richard finally spoke, his voice smooth, controlled, the kind of voice that fills a room without raising itself. We are restructuring after Q3, he said, glancing between Olivia and Ryan. Cutting dead weight, focusing on high-performance divisions. And there it was, the phrase, dead weight, simple, efficient, dehumanizing in a way that makes decisions easier, and I could almost see how they categorized people in their heads, who mattered, who did not, who could be removed without consequence, and I wondered, just briefly, where they had placed me, not that it changed anything, but because it was interesting, because people reveal their hierarchy without realizing it. Olivia stepped in then, her voice confident, polished. We have already identified areas where we can optimize, she said, and I recognized that tone. I had heard it before, late nights at home, when she would rehearse presentations, when she would talk through strategies like she was convincing herself as much as anyone else. And I supported that once, quietly, consistently, never needing credit, never needing acknowledgement, because that was never the point. The point was building something that worked, something that lasted, but somewhere along the way, that quiet support had turned into invisibility in her eyes, and now here we were, in a room full of people who believed that story completely, and I let them, I let all of it settle, every word, every glance, every misplaced assumption. Because stopping it now would have been easy, too easy, and easy does not teach anyone anything, easy does not expose anything real. I needed more. I needed them comfortable enough to stop performing, to stop pretending, to show exactly how they thought when they believed there was no risk. Ryan laughed again, raising his glass toward Olivia. You are going to go far, he said. Just make sure you do not drag unnecessary baggage with you. And this time the room reacted differently, a few chuckles, a few knowing looks, and Olivia smiled, not rejecting it, not correcting it, just accepting the compliment wrapped in insult, and that was enough, not everything, but enough for now. I reached for my glass again, took a slow sip, and nodded slightly like I agreed with all of it, like I understood my place, because the truth was, I did understand, better than any of them, and the more they talked, the clearer it became. This was not just a conversation, it was a map. A layout of how they saw the world, how they made decisions, who they valued, and who they were ready to discard. And maps are useful, especially when you already know where every exit leads. There is a moment in every room like that when the noise stops meaning anything and the patterns start to show, and I felt it settle in somewhere behind my ribs, quiet, steady, like a switch had flipped, because once you stop reacting, you start seeing. And what I saw that night was not just arrogance or ego or even disrespect, it was structure, it was how they operated when they believed there were no consequences, and that matters. Because systems reveal themselves long before they break. Ryan kept talking, filling space the way men like him always do, confident, unchallenged, mistaking volume for authority, while Richard listened with that measured stillness that passes for control in rooms like this, and Olivia stayed right where she needed to be, close enough to be seen, far enough to not be questioned, and I watched her again, not as my wife, not in the way I used to, but as part of the system she had chosen to align with, because once you remove the personal, everything becomes easier to understand. I turned slightly, letting my gaze drift across the table, taking in faces, expressions, small reactions that most people would miss, the junior analyst who laughed a second too late, the operations manager who avoided eye contact when certain numbers were mentioned, the assistant who kept checking her phone like she was waiting for something that had not arrived yet, details small, forgettable on their own, but together they told a story, and I have always been good at reading stories, especially the ones people do not realize they are telling. Someone asked about timelines, something about end-of-quarter targets, and Richard answered without hesitation, outlining a plan that sounded clean on the surface but left gaps if you knew where to look, gaps in accountability, gaps in oversight, the kind of gaps that only exist when people are certain no one above them is paying attention, and that almost made me smile, not because it was clever, but because it was predictable. People assume distance means absence, that if they do not see you, you are not there. That if you are not speaking, you are not listening, and that assumption has a way of unraveling everything. Olivia leaned in then, her voice lower, more focused, discussing reallocations, talking about shifting resources like she had already made the decision, like approval was just a formality. And maybe in her mind it was, maybe that was what she had come to believe, that the rules were flexible. That authority was something you could step into if you acted like you already had it, and for a while, that works, until it does not, until someone reminds you where the lines actually are. I reached for my glass again, but did not drink, just held it, letting the cold settle into my palm, grounding, steady, because the more I listened, the clearer the picture became. This was not a single moment, not just a dinner or a few careless jokes. This had been building for a while, decisions made in rooms like this, reinforced by conversations like this, unchecked because no one thought they needed to check them, and that was the real problem, not Ryan or his comments, not even Olivia and her silence. It was the confidence, the certainty that they could say anything, do anything, and it would hold, that nothing would push back, and that kind of certainty always comes at a cost, even if they do not see it yet. Ryan glanced at me again, like he had remembered I was still there, still part of the scenery. And he smirked slightly. "You are quiet tonight," he said, tone casual, almost friendly now, like we had moved past the jokes into something softer, something more acceptable, and I nodded once, slow, measured. "Just listening," I said, and that was the truth, more truth than he would ever understand, because listening is not passive, not when you are paying attention the right way, not when every word has a place, every detail has a purpose. And he laughed lightly, turning back to the others, already dismissing me again, already comfortable. And that was exactly what I needed, because comfort lowers defenses, it makes people careless, it makes them forget that every system has an edge. Every structure has a boundary, and once you step past it, there is no pulling it back. You just have to wait for the moment it shows itself. And as I sat there, in that room filled with quiet confidence and easy laughter, I realized something simple, something that settled deeper than anything else that night. I was not the one out of place, they just did not know it yet. The music shifted somewhere behind us, something softer, jazz maybe, the kind of background sound that makes people feel more important than they are, and I noticed how the room adjusted with it, conversations loosening, posture relaxing, laughter coming easier now that the formal edge had worn off, and that was when things usually slipped, not in the loud moments, but in the quiet ones that follow. When people believe the performance is over, Olivia stepped away for a second, pulled into another circle of colleagues who greeted her like she was already one of them, and I let her go without a word, without even watching her leave, because I already knew what that looked like. I had seen that version of her before, the one who adapted to whatever room she walked into, the one who mirrored ambition until it became her own reflection, and there was nothing left there for me to learn, so I stayed where I was, anchored, unnoticed. And that was when Richard shifted his attention fully toward Ryan, their voices lowering just enough to suggest privacy without actually creating it. "We cannot afford another oversight like last quarter," Richard said, tone calm but firm, the kind that carries weight without needing volume, and Ryan nodded quickly, confidence still there but edged now with something tighter, something aware. "It will not happen again," he said, and I caught the phrasing, not if, not maybe, but a promise made too easily, the kind of promise that usually covers something unfinished, something not fully understood, and I filed that away, because words like that tend to matter later. I leaned slightly to the side, adjusting my chair just enough to catch a clearer angle, not obvious, not intrusive, just a small shift that brought their conversation into focus, and no one stopped, no one hesitated. Because why would they? I was still just the background, still the man they had already categorized, and that assumption kept working in my favor. Richard continued, outlining expectations, mentioning compliance, internal reviews, timelines that felt compressed in a way that only happens when something is being rushed, and Ryan responded with confidence that sounded practiced, like he had said the same lines before, like he believed repetition made them true, and maybe to him it did. Maybe that was enough, but systems do not run on belief, they run on structure. On checks that exist whether people respect them or not, and I knew those structures better than anyone in that room, better than Richard, better than Ryan, better than Olivia, because I had built them, piece by piece, long before most of these people had even heard the company name, and that thought passed through me without ego, without pride, just fact, the kind of fact that sits quietly until it is needed. And tonight it was getting closer to that point. Olivia returned a moment later, slipping back into place beside Ryan, her energy sharper now, more aligned with the tone of the conversation, and she spoke without hesitation, offering a suggestion about resource allocation that sounded efficient on the surface but ignored a key constraint, something subtle, something most people would not catch, but I did, instantly, because I remembered exactly why that constraint existed in the first place. I remembered the meeting 5 years ago when we put it in place, the numbers, the risk, the decision to limit exposure in a specific division, and hearing her dismiss it now, casually, confidently, told me everything I needed to know. She did not understand the foundation she was standing on. She only understood the surface, and that is where mistakes begin, not in ignorance, but in misplaced certainty. Ryan nodded along, encouraging it, reinforcing it, because it fit his narrative, because it supported the direction he wanted to push, and Richard listened, considering, weighing, not rejecting it outright, and that was the moment that mattered, not the suggestion itself, but the fact that it was being entertained at all, because once a flawed idea is given space, it starts to feel valid, and that is how systems drift, slowly, quietly, until the consequences catch up. I let out a small breath, barely noticeable, and set my glass down again, the soft click against the table grounding me in the present, because this was no longer just observation, this was confirmation. The pattern was clear now, the gaps, the assumptions, the overconfidence. All of it aligned in a way that made the outcome predictable, and predictability is power if you know how to use it. Ryan glanced at me once more, almost as an afterthought. "Still with us?" he said, half joking, half dismissive, and I met his gaze for just a second, calm, steady, no edge, no reaction. "I am exactly where I need to be," I said, and he laughed, because of course he did, because to him that sounded like nothing, just another empty line from a man who did not matter, and that was fine, that was more than fine, because the more invisible I remained, the more they revealed, and as the conversation carried on, drifting into specifics, into decisions that would ripple far beyond this room, I realized something else, something simple but important. They were not just comfortable, they were exposed, they just did not know it yet. There is a point when listening stops being passive and starts turning into something sharper, something deliberate, and I could feel that shift settling in as the conversation around me moved from ideas into decisions, not loud ones, not dramatic, just quiet agreements made between people who believed they understood the board they were playing on, and that was always where the real mistakes happened, not in chaos, but in confidence. Olivia leaned forward slightly, her voice steady, outlining a revised allocation that sounded clean, efficient, almost impressive if you did not know what sat underneath it, and Ryan backed her immediately, reinforcing the logic, adding just enough detail to make it feel complete, and Richard listened, nodding once, slow, thoughtful, not approving yet but not pushing back either, and that hesitation, that small window of consideration. That was the moment everything hinged on, because once an idea like that crosses from suggestion into acceptance, it does not stay contained, it spreads, it shapes decisions, it rewrites structure in ways people do not fully understand until it is too late. I rested my hands lightly on the table, fingers still, posture relaxed, because outwardly nothing had changed. I was still the same man they had dismissed 20 minutes ago, still the quiet presence they did not account for, but internally the picture was complete now. Every piece aligned in a way that made the next steps obvious, not emotionally, not impulsively, just logically, the way systems demand, because at the end of the day, this was never about pride, never about being disrespected in a room full of strangers, it was about integrity, about something being built the right way and then slowly, quietly, being pulled in a direction that would break it, and I had seen that happen before, years ago, in smaller ways, in different rooms. And I had learned from it, learned that you do not stop it with arguments or reactions. You stop it with timing, with clarity, with letting people show exactly how far they are willing to go before you draw the line. Ryan was still talking, confident, assured, laying out projections that leaned heavily on assumptions that had not been tested, and Olivia mirrored that confidence, reinforcing it, building on it, and for a moment I wondered if she even realized what she was doing. If she understood the weight of the decisions she was stepping into, or if she had simply convinced herself that she belonged there enough that the details no longer mattered, and that thought passed just as quickly as it came, because whether she understood it or not did not change the outcome, it only explained how we got here. Richard finally spoke again, asking a question about risk exposure, and there was a pause, brief but noticeable, the kind that tells you something has not been fully considered, and Ryan answered quickly, too quickly, smoothing it over with generalities, and Olivia nodded again, supporting it without adding anything concrete, and that was it. That was the confirmation, not in what they said, but in what they avoided, in the gap between question and answer, because that gap is where truth lives, and they had stepped right over it without noticing. I picked up my glass, took a slow sip, letting the silence settle for half a second longer than comfortable, just enough to feel it, just enough to mark it, and then I set it down again, precise, controlled, because the next part mattered, not in volume, not in force, but in presence, in timing. In choosing the exact moment when the room shifts without understanding why. I glanced once toward Olivia, not long. Just enough to see her expression, composed, confident, completely unaware of where this was heading, and there was something almost distant about that, not cold, not bitter, just removed, like looking at a version of something that used to be familiar and realizing it no longer fits. Ryan leaned back in his chair, satisfied, like the conversation had landed exactly where he wanted it, and Richard nodded once more. Slower this time, like he was ready to move forward, and that was when I knew. The window was closing, the space for observation narrowing into a single point where action becomes necessary, not dramatic, not emotional, just inevitable. I rested my hand flat against the table, feeling the smooth surface under my palm, grounding, steady, and I let one quiet breath pass before I spoke, not loud, not sharp, just clear enough to cut through the rhythm they had settled into. That constraint exists for a reason, I said, tone calm, measured, like I was simply adding to the conversation, like I had been part of it all along, and the effect was immediate, not explosive, not obvious, but real, the kind of shift you feel before you fully see it, a slight pause, a flicker of attention. Ryan turning just a fraction, Olivia going still beside him, Richard's gaze settling on me with something new behind it, something that had not been there before, not recognition, not yet, but awareness, and that was enough, more than enough, because for the first time that night, I was no longer invisible, and once that changes, everything else follows. The silence did not hit all at once, it crept in, subtle, like the air shifting before a storm you do not see yet, and for a second no one moved, not because they were shocked, but because they were recalibrating, trying to understand why the background voice had suddenly stepped into the foreground without permission. Ryan was the first to react. Of course he was, a small laugh, dismissive, controlled. The kind people use when they think they can smooth over something unexpected. And what reason would that be? He asked, leaning back like he still owned the room, like this was still his conversation, and I met his gaze without changing posture, without adding weight to the moment, just steady. Because the last time that constraint was ignored, it cost the company $12.4 million in a single quarter. I said, tone even, not accusing, not dramatic, just precise, and that number did something the laughter could not undo. It landed, heavy, specific, real, and I saw it register, not just with Ryan, but with Richard, his expression tightening just slightly, not enough for most people to notice, but enough, because numbers like that are not abstract, they have memory attached to them, they carry consequences. Olivia shifted beside Ryan, just a fraction, her confidence flickering in a way she tried to hide, but it was there, in the stillness of her shoulders, in the way her hand paused on the edge of the table, and for the first time that night she looked at me not as background, but as something she needed to reassess. Richard leaned forward slightly, his attention no longer split, no longer casual. And you are basing that on? He asked, voice calm but sharper now, the kind of question that tests not just the answer, but the person giving it, and I nodded once, like the question was expected. Like it belonged here. Internal review, fourth quarter, 5 years ago, I said. The report flagged the exact same exposure point you are about to reopen. And I let that sit for half a second before adding. It was closed for a reason. Not louder, not stronger, just clearer, and this time the silence was different, not passive, not drifting, but focused, because now there was tension in it, not loud tension, not conflict, just the quiet awareness that something had shifted. Ryan's smile did not disappear, but it tightened, became more deliberate. I do not remember seeing that in the recent documentation, he said, tone still confident, but now there was effort behind it, and I nodded again, slow, acknowledging. You would not, I said. It was removed from the standard briefing packages 3 years ago when reporting structures changed. And that was when Richard's expression changed in a way that mattered, not dramatically, not visibly to everyone, but enough that the direction of the room followed it. Because authority does not need volume, it needs alignment, and for the first time that night, his attention was not on Ryan, not on Olivia, it was on me, fully, directly. Continue, he said, and that single word carried more weight than anything that had been said all evening, because it was not a request, it was a shift in control, and I did not rush, did not fill the space with unnecessary detail, I kept it measured, intentional. The constraint limits capital exposure in that division to prevent cascading losses across adjacent units, I said. Without it, your projections depend on perfect execution across 3 independent teams that have not been aligned in over 18 months. And I let that land because the point was not to overwhelm, it was to clarify, to bring the structure back into focus. Olivia's eyes flicked toward Ryan, quick, almost instinctive, and then back to me, and I saw it then, not panic, not yet, but uncertainty, the kind that comes when the foundation you were standing on starts to feel less solid than you thought. Ryan straightened slightly, adjusting his posture, recalibrating. We have updated coordination protocols, he said, but it sounded thinner now, less certain, and Richard did not respond immediately, which told me everything, because hesitation at that level is not about doubt, it is about recalculation, and I stayed exactly where I was, not pressing, not pushing, just present, because this was not about winning an argument, it was about restoring clarity. About letting the system correct itself once the right information was in place. And as the room settled into this new alignment, I realized something else, something simple, something inevitable. The moment you stop being invisible is the moment everything they assumed about you starts to fall apart, and there is no easy way back from that. Richard did not speak right away, and that silence carried more authority than anything he could have said, because now the room was waiting, not for Ryan, not for Olivia, but for him, and more importantly, for what came next. His gaze stayed on me for a moment longer, measuring, not dismissing, not interrupting, just recalibrating, and then he shifted slightly in his chair. A small movement that somehow redirected the entire energy of the table. "What else was removed?" he asked, tone steady. Controlled. But now there was intent behind it, and that question was not casual, it was strategic. Because once you realize something has been left out, you start wondering what else is missing, and that is where the real cracks begin to show. I did not rush the answer. I let a second pass, just enough to acknowledge the weight of it. 3 reporting checkpoints, I said. 2 compliance triggers, and a variance threshold that used to require executive review before reallocation. And I watched it land, not dramatically, not explosively, but precisely, because each piece added pressure, not emotion, just structure. Ryan shifted again, more noticeably this time, his confidence no longer effortless, now maintained. "Those were outdated protocols," he said quickly. "They slowed down decision-making." And I nodded slightly, not dismissing, not agreeing, just allowing the statement to exist. "They slowed down risk," I replied, just as calm, just as even, and that was enough to tilt the balance further, because now it was not about speed versus efficiency, it was about control versus exposure, and those are not the same thing. Olivia's posture changed again, subtle but clear, her shoulders drawing back just slightly, her expression tightening, not visibly to everyone, but enough that if you were paying attention, you could see the shift from confidence into calculation, and that told me something important. She was starting to realize this was not a conversation she fully understood anymore, not because she lacked intelligence, but because she had stepped into a layer of the system she had never actually seen before. Richard exhaled slowly, his fingers tapping once against the table, not impatient, just thoughtful, and then he turned his attention toward Ryan, not aggressively, not confrontationally, just directly. "Why were those removed?" he asked, and that question changed everything, because now it was not me presenting information, it was Ryan being asked to justify decisions, and there is a difference between explaining something you understand and defending something you assumed. Ryan hesitated, just a fraction, but it was there, and in rooms like this, fractions matter. "We streamlined reporting after the restructuring," he said, "to improve efficiency across departments." And it sounded reasonable, it always does, because the best justifications are built on partial truths, but Richard did not nod this time, did not move forward, he just held the moment, letting it sit, letting the gap widen slightly, and that was when the weight of everything started to settle in, not as a shock, not as a collapse, but as a slow, unavoidable realization that the structure they thought they were operating within was not as stable as they believed. I stayed quiet then, intentionally, because this was not my moment to dominate. It was my moment to step back and let the system respond to itself, and that is where real shifts happen, not when one person forces a conclusion, but when the room arrives at it on its own. Olivia glanced at me again, longer this time, searching, not for confirmation, but for understanding, and I did not give her anything more than what was already there, calm, steady, present, because explanations do not help when someone is still processing. Ryan cleared his throat slightly, trying to regain control of the narrative. "We can revisit those controls if necessary," he said, but the tone had changed, the certainty softened, and that was enough. Because once certainty cracks, it does not fully recover in the same space. Richard nodded once, slow, deliberate. "We will," he said, and that was not a suggestion, not a possibility, it was a decision, and the room felt it, the shift settling into place like something locking into alignment, and for a brief moment, everything went quiet again, not the earlier kind of quiet filled with dismissal, but a different one, heavier, more aware. And I let that moment pass without adding to it, without claiming anything, because there was nothing to claim. This was never about proving a point, it was about restoring one. And as I leaned back slightly, returning to the same relaxed posture I had held all night, I realized something simple, something almost inevitable. Once people see what they missed, they cannot unsee it, and once that happens, the room never feels the same again. No one picked up their glass after that, not right away. And that was new, because rooms like this are built on motion, on noise, on the constant rhythm of people reinforcing each other. But now there was a pause in it, a break in the pattern, and once that happens, it does not fix itself, it lingers. Richard remained still for a moment longer, then reached for his phone, not casually, not as a distraction, but with purpose. And that alone shifted the weight in the room again, because when someone at his level stops talking and starts verifying, it means something has crossed from conversation into action. He tapped the screen once, then again, scrolling briefly, his expression unreadable, controlled in a way that did not invite interruption, and no one interrupted, not Ryan, not Olivia, not anyone else at the table, because whatever confidence had been there earlier had thinned, replaced by something more careful, more aware. I did not move, did not lean in, did not add to the moment. I just watched, because this was exactly where things were supposed to go, not explosive, not dramatic, just inevitable. Richard set his phone down after a few seconds, slower than he had picked it up, and when he looked up, his attention went first to Ryan, not with anger, not with accusation, just with a level of focus that made the rest of the room disappear. "We will suspend that reallocation," he said, tone even, final, and there was no room in it for debate. Ryan opened his mouth slightly, like he might respond, might adjust, might recover the ground he had lost, but nothing came out, because there was nothing to say that would not make it worse. Olivia stayed still beside him, her composure intact on the surface, but the shift was there, in the way she held herself, in the silence she did not break, and that silence said more than anything she could have added. Richard continued, his gaze moving briefly across the table before settling again. "I want a full review of the reporting changes from the last 3 years," he said, "including who approved the removals and why." And that was it, not loud, not aggressive, just clear, and the kind of clarity that restructures things without needing to raise its voice. A couple of people at the table shifted slightly, not visibly enough to draw attention, but enough to show they understood the implication, because reviews like that do not stay contained, they spread, they uncover, they connect decisions that were never meant to be examined together, and suddenly the room felt smaller, tighter, like the walls had moved in just a fraction. I picked up my glass again, not because I needed to drink, but because the motion itself mattered. It reset my place in the scene, returned me to the role I had started with, the quiet observer, the one who did not need to hold the center once the shift had already happened. Ryan cleared his throat, trying to find footing again. "We can have that compiled by early next week," he said, tone controlled, but no longer confident, and Richard nodded once, acknowledging, not encouraging, just moving forward. Olivia finally spoke then, her voice steady, professional, exactly the way it had been at the beginning of the night. "I will coordinate with compliance and finance," she said, and for a moment it almost sounded like everything had returned to normal, like the structure of the conversation had reset itself, but it had not really, because underneath the words, the alignment had changed, the assumptions had shifted, and that does not reverse just because people choose familiar language. Richard leaned back slightly, the tension in his posture easing, not because the issue was resolved, but because it was now contained, defined, something that would be addressed in the proper channels. And that is how real control works, not in public displays, but in quiet decisions that ripple outward. He glanced at me once more, brief but deliberate, and there was something different in it now, not curiosity, not dismissal, but recognition, not fully formed, not spoken, just there. And I nodded slightly in return, nothing more, because anything more would have changed the balance again, and that was not necessary. The room began to move again after that, slowly at first, conversations restarting in smaller pockets, voices lower, more measured, like everyone was recalibrating what they said and how they said it, and I let it happen, did not re-enter, did not insert myself back into the flow, because my role in this moment was already complete. Olivia turned toward me after a few seconds, her expression composed, but her eyes searching in a way they had not been before, like she was trying to reconcile two different versions of the same person, and I met her gaze calmly, without explanation, without accusation, just present, because some realizations cannot be handed to someone, they have to form on their own, and as the night continued around us, softer now, more controlled, I realized something simple, something that had been true from the beginning. once people become comfortable. They show you everything you need to see, and once you have seen it, you do not need to do much at all, you just have to choose the right moment to speak. The night did not end with applause or confrontation. It never does in rooms like that. It ends quietly, with people adjusting their tone, recalibrating their posture, pretending nothing shifted even though everything did, and I stayed seated for a moment longer after the conversation dissolved into smaller groups again, letting the rhythm of the room return without me needing to be part of it, because once the balance changes, you do not need to force anything else, it carries on its own. I finished the last sip in my glass, set it down gently, and stood, not abruptly, not in a way that drew attention, just enough to mark my own exit from the center of something that no longer required me. Olivia noticed immediately, of course she did, her attention sharper now, more aware, and she stepped toward me, her heels soft against the polished floor, her voice lower than before, more careful. "Ethan," she said, just my name, nothing else, like she was testing how it sounded now, like she was hearing it differently for the first time in a long while, and I turned slightly, giving her my full attention. Without stepping closer, without closing the space between us, because that distance mattered, not physically, but in everything it represented. "You could have said something earlier," she added, and there was no accusation in it, not exactly, more like confusion, like she was trying to understand how the man she thought she knew had chosen silence instead of correction, and I nodded once, calm, steady. "I did," I said, "just not out loud." And that answer hung there for a second, not because it was unclear, but because it carried more meaning than she expected. Her expression shifted slightly, the confidence from earlier replaced with something more introspective, more uncertain, and she glanced back briefly toward the table where Ryan and Richard were still speaking, their conversation quieter now, more contained, then back to me. "They were out of line," she said, almost as if she needed to say it, almost as if acknowledging it would reset something, and I shook my head slightly. Not dismissing, just clarifying. "No," I said. "They were comfortable." And that word settled between us in a way that explained more than anything else could have, because comfort is not an accident, it is built, encouraged, allowed, and she understood that. I could see it in the way her shoulders dropped just a fraction, in the way her gaze shifted inward for a moment before returning to me, searching again, not for validation this time, but for something else, something harder to define. "You let it happen," she said quietly, and I nodded, not denying it, not softening it, just acknowledging the truth of it. "I needed to know how far it went," I replied, and there was no edge in my voice, no bitterness, just clarity, because that was all this had ever been about, not punishment, not pride, just understanding the full shape of what had been built around me. She did not respond right away, and for the first time that night, she did not seem to have the right words ready, the polished response, the controlled tone, and that silence was honest in a way nothing else had been. I glanced once more toward the room, now filled with quieter conversations, more careful laughter. The energy shifted in a way that would linger long after we left, and I realized something simple, something that had been true from the start. Moments like this do not change everything at once, they change direction, and direction is what matters. I looked back at Olivia, meeting her eyes fully, not with anger, not with distance, just with the same calm presence I had carried all night, and I gave a small nod, not as a conclusion, not as forgiveness, just as acknowledgement. Then I stepped past her, moving toward the exit without hesitation, without looking back, because there was nothing left in that room for me to confirm. Nothing left to prove. The doors opened with a soft shift of air as I stepped into the hallway, quieter, cooler, removed from the noise behind me, and as the sound of the ballroom faded, I let out a slow breath I had not realized I was holding, not from relief, not from tension, just from completion. Because the truth is, when people show you exactly who they are when they feel safe, you do not need to react, you do not need to argue, you just need to remember it, and choose what you do next with that clarity.